So as I was saying just a moment ago, this movie still terrifies me at the age of 43. Makes me feel like I'm 15. And I think the thing that...
You got to get a hold of yourself.
Yeah, no. Therapy has helped a little bit. I think the thing that really gets me every time is that as you watch it, you feel like this is happening. You feel like this is presented in a very... It's the uncanny presented as in a very realistic fashion. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, if that was what your approach was to the material.
Well, first of all, it's based on an actual case. Yes. Where something quite similar did happen. In 1949 in Silver Spring, Maryland, it was a 14-year-old boy from a Lutheran family, not Catholic, and he manifested all the symptoms that you see here and more. And they put him through all that medical science had and psychiatry, and they studied his brain as well as they could in those days. And the Catholic Church finally, their Lutheran minister, the family's Lutheran minister, suggested they go to the Catholic Church and see if the case warranted an exorcism, because the Lutherans don't have that in their ritual. The Catholic Church in the 20th century authenticated only 3 cases that we know in the United States as being demonic possession and requiring an exorcism. And the 1949 case was one of them. Now, if you have an iPad or a computer, you can Google that case. There's a 3-page, front-page story in the Washington Post. You just have to put in something like 49 exorcism case, Washington Post, and there's a very long account of what happened in a major big city newspaper. And so Bill Blatty, who wrote the novel and the screenplay, was an undergraduate at Georgetown when this happened. And it's what inspired him. Now, to take your point, I think there's several reasons why The Exorcist, after 40 years, still continues to upset people, or let's say frighten them, or however you might call it. The first reason, I think, goes back to St. Augustine in his Confessions, written in the 4th century, wonders why people were going to the theater in those days, in the year 359 or whatever, why people went to the theater to see actors exhibit pain and suffering. And the people who went were not satisfied unless the actors portrayed as much pain and suffering as they, the spectators, could see it. Now, why was that? In a way, it was a kind of release that pertains to the other 2 reasons I'm going to discuss with you. The first reason is something called expectancy. From the time The Exorcist came out, people had heard that it was a scary film. You hear something is scary, your mind is preset to be frightened. It's like walking down a street in your own life, or going somewhere where something terrible has happened. Maybe a bad accident, or a robbery, or a murder, and you go down that same street at night or by day, or to that place, and you'll get a chilly feeling. I got it yesterday when I went to visit the Texas School Book Depository. You get, for those of you, how many of you have been over there and seen that exhibit? Well, you know it's pretty chilling. A lot of you may not have been alive when that happened. I was just born. No. But you go into the School Book Depository. It's now a museum, beautifully organized and very clear and concise about all they know that happened. And yet you get this expectancy set, this chill. And when you come into a movie theater, you have that, but you are also in a kind of safe darkness. You're sitting in a movie theater, usually surrounded by other people who are going through the same experience, but you know that you can get up when it's over and walk out. You know, this isn't happening to you really, Chris. It's happening.
That's a relief.
Okay. Well, it's happening to someone else. So what a film like this draws upon are those three factors, especially the safe darkness.
I want to get some questions from other people, but first, very quickly, when I met you once before and you told I thought it was a very funny story about the original poster design for The Exorcist.
Boy, I don't know that it was funny.
And your feeling, I thought it was funny. You were pretty upset about it. I was wondering if you could just relay that quickly.
Well, when I first saw the print ad that Warner Brothers wanted to use for The Exorcist, the advertising department showed me it was a drawing of a little girl's hand holding a bloody crucifix. And beneath this drawing it said, "For God's sake, help her." And I remember throwing this piece of paper across the room. I might have eventually torn it up, and I remember saying, you can't do this. Number one, you cannot use God's name in an ad. You know, God's not shilling for you. So you got to get rid of that, and you can't take the most disturbing scene in the film, or one of them, and one that is certainly filled with very ugly and dark connotations, and focus on that. And they were alarmed, and they said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Let's take a still frame from the film that is iconic, that will become a metaphor for the film. A silhouette of the priest approaching the house." And that was inspired by a Magritte painting called Empire of Light. And I said, I don't want to hit people over the head with the content of this film. They'll get it soon enough. They'll hear about it. Let's underplay it, and that's what we wound up with. Now, I didn't know that was... Anyone here think that was funny? No, you're laughing. I guess Chris is right.
Who has a question for Mr. Friedkin? Sir.
You have one of the rarities where you won Best Picture, or had one of the first rated R movies to win Best Picture, then followed up by one of the first horror films to be nominated for Best Picture. Can you talk about, with the French Connection, some of your experiences working on that, how that transpired into The Exorcist, and your reaction when you were nominated for Best Picture?
Oh, I wanted to kill myself when I was nominated. What a horrible thought to get nominated for Best Picture. You have the answer to that, don't you? I mean, it's a wonderful feeling. You know, it's like, hey, Mark. Is that Mark? How you doing, Mark? Good to see you. You know, it's sort of like getting the Star Award here at the Dallas Film Festival. It's a very thrilling and encouraging thing that happens to you. And you have to be very lucky to have something like that happen. It has nothing to do with talent or brains or even content. You know, there are many great films. Did you ever hear of Citizen Kane? Yes. Has anyone ever heard of it? If you haven't, just a minute. If you have not heard of Citizen Kane, get the hell out of here. Anybody in this audience that has not, I don't care if you're a film critic or if you own this theater, if you have never heard of Citizen Kane, get out immediately. For me, it was my inspiration. How you doing tonight? It was the greatest film ever made. It made me want to become a filmmaker. It didn't win the Academy Award. You know, it won an Academy Award for screenplay that Orson Welles shared with a man called Herman Mankiewicz. And I think it may have won one other, but I'm not sure. But those were R-rated pictures. The Exorcist today would be rated NC-17, triple, there aren't enough X's in the alphabet for what The Exorcist would be rated today.
Really?
In those days, the ratings board was very liberal, and they were not out to censor films, just warn people about content so that parents could decide if they wanted their children to see them or not. And that's all the ratings board should do. But they go far beyond that today, and they censor films. I think that answers your question. I made 2 R-rated films back to back. They were very well received, for which I'm very grateful. Why it happened, I can't say. It's really by the grace of God.
I would say those are 2 of the great American movies.
Thank you. Thank you. I owe him $5 for that.
Sir, right up here.
Yes, can you talk a little about the sound design in The Exorcist, and maybe discuss what were you listening to and what were your influences in coming up with the sound design?
The Exorcist soundtrack is loaded, as you can tell, especially in 5.1 surround. It has a lot of stuff in it, including the sounds of during the exorcism sequence. I mixed into the track sections of a cassette tape I was given by one of the priests who's in the film, who got it from an exorcism that was done in the Vatican, in the basement of the Vatican, and recorded on quarter-inch or cassette tape. And he got me a copy of this tape, and the ungodly sounds I heard on it, I mixed into some of the demon shouts. I do the soundtrack to all my films separately because probably my greatest influence is probably dramatic radio of the 1940s. Do any of you ever remember dramatic radio shows? You know, radio, you know, no-inch television. You've heard of that. There were programs called Inner Sanctum and I Love a Mystery and Suspense. And as a kid, you know, I grew up before television. And I used to listen to these programs, and they influenced me tremendously as a filmmaker. And you're going to see Citizen Kane, aren't you?
I've already seen it.
They were a tremendous influence on me. And so, especially with this film, I tried to make the soundtrack stand alone. Oh, there's Big Al, right? How you doing, Big Al? Nice to see you. Friend from Chicago. Used to have a radio show there, so he remembers dramatic radio very well. At the station where I work, by the way. But anyway, the demon voice, for example, I experimented a lot. I went to this guy, Ken Nordine. You remember him, Al? He had one of the greatest voices in radio. He did a lot of commercials. And he also created a lot of vocal effects and did recordings called word jazz, which he ad-libbed over jazz music. I went to Ken and said, why don't you, go all out, and I'll finance some experiments, and let's see if you can do the demon voice. And he did some experiments, and none of them worked for the reason that it was always a man's voice. I listened to it, and he did some really far-out things, but it was a man's voice. And I didn't want it to be a man's voice, no matter how gruesome. So then I started to think, well, it can't really be a woman's voice either. Blatty writes about this horrible growling sound from the bowels of the earth, a bunch of very creative prose about what the demon voice sounded like. But I didn't want it to be either. I wanted it to be something in between. And I didn't know what the hell I was talking about or thinking about. Then I remembered, as though like a flash, I remembered this great radio actress named Mercedes Mccambridge. And she was in Giant, by the way, and she won an Academy Award for Giant. Anyone here who hasn't seen Giant?
Get out.
Oh, you haven't seen, there he goes. There you go, I knew it. Okay, so I didn't know if Mercedes Mccambridge was alive or dead. And we did some checking. We found out that she was here in Dallas for 6 weeks doing a road company of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, because she was playing Martha. And I called her, and I told her what we were up to, and she said, when do you need me? And I said, yesterday. And she said, all right, I'll come and see the film in about 6 weeks. And she did. I ran the film for her, and she said, what do you know about me? What do you know about me personally? And I said, nothing, just that you're a very great actress, and I remember you from radio. She said, no, do you know anything about my personal life? I said, no. She said, I was an alcoholic. I was in AA for many years. I'm a Catholic. I was raised Catholic, and I still am. She said, if I did this for you, I would have to have 2 priests, friends of mine, in the sound room with me at all times. I said, okay. Anything else? She said, yes. Here's how we're going to do this. I want you to bind me to a chair, tie me up with my hands behind my back. I'll be sitting in a squat position on a chair, tied to the chair, and I want you to feed me raw eggs, and I'm going to have to drink whiskey again and go back on booze. And she preferred Jack Daniels, and she would sit there for hours swallowing these raw eggs, Jack Daniels, and smoking maybe 2 or 3 packs of cigarettes at a session. And then, as her voice got tuned up in that way, you would hear these otherworldly sounds appear from her throat. You'd hear 2 or 3 different tracks coming out of her throat at once. And I kept that in the film. And then some of the things she recorded, sentence by sentence, sometimes word for word, I played some of the takes twice in the same section. So it sounded like several voices coming out of her at once. And then I added sounds, animals being led to slaughter, the exorcism in Italy. And then we created I experimented with everything you could do in terms of making otherworldly sounds. And it's very simple, a lot of what we did. For example, the sound of the demon's head turning completely around, the sound of that was made by a cracked old leather wallet with credit cards in it, held very close to a microphone, and a guy kind of squeezing the wallet and the credit cards very closely mic'd. And that's the sound of the bones cracking in the head tube. And so we experimented with a lot of stuff and arrived at the soundtrack that you've heard tonight. The music was all contemporary at that time, classical music, by composers I'm sure you're all familiar with. Krzysztof Penderecki, George Crumb, Hans Werner Henze. You ever hear of these guys?
No.
Out of here. What kind of audience you got for me? These guys are now even more famous than they were then in the world of contemporary classical music, which was 12-tone, no melody. I wanted the music to be like a cold hand on the back of your neck. And these guys that I just mentioned wrote music like that. And I took excerpts from all their music. And then I thought, but I want something to play sort of over this stuff. Something like Brahms Lullaby, like a child's theme. you know, childhood theme. And I went to the music director at Warner Brothers and I described it, and he said, well, why don't you use Brahms Lullaby? Do you know Brahms Lullaby?
No, I do not.
What?
No, I do not.
You have to leave the room. You guys know Brahms Lullaby. Da-da-dum,
Oh, that one.
da-da-dum,
Yes, yes.
da-da-da-dum, da-da-da. For my fourth and final number, I will now sing. Anyway, I wanted something like that. And the music director said, why don't you go into that room over there where we get a bunch of recordings that come in here from people who want Warner Brothers to release their music. And they come in on big demos. And the demos then were, have you ever seen them, Chris? Large acetates, and they were played with a needle drop, like a 33 1/3. These were 33 1/3, but they were at least that big around. The size, a good size flat pizza. And I went into the room not knowing what I was going to hear. There was all this stuff. And after 2 days of it, I put on a recording that was labeled Tubular Bells, that was made by a new company called Virgin Records. And they had not had a recording released in America. This was the first one they'd sent in. And I put the needle on the acetate, and I played it, and there it was, exactly what I was looking for. Except I don't know how many of you have ever heard the whole thing, because the whole recording is a narration record. Mike Oldfield, the guy who wrote and recorded it, he does a narration for the whole record. This is what this bell sounds like, and another bell sounds like that. And all I used was about the first 50 seconds of it, which is that very haunting theme. Anything else?
I just keep thinking that the Exorcist knocked Mercedes Mccambridge off the wagon.
And a lot of other people as well.
And a lot of other people as well.
But this gentleman, who I've seen a few times, has.
Thank you. Just wondering about your relationships with the actors in The Exorcist. How much did you just let them fly with how they felt they should act, or versus the percentage of saying, I want you to do this, 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 and this?
The question was, in my relationship with the actors, how much did I tell them I want you to do it this way precisely, or let them improvise, or what? I rehearsed The Exorcist in the top room of a restaurant in New York called Alan Dick's. It was an empty space. And I rehearsed the film there, and I rehearsed it to the extent that I could have put it on the stage, with the exception of the Iraq sequence, of course. And then we started getting ready to film, and I found that I had over-rehearsed it. I squeezed the life out of it. And everyone was hitting their mark, and everyone was saying the lines the way I wanted them to and the way I approved, and it was dead. It was dead on arrival. And I remember thinking, what the hell am I going to do? And I then said to them, forget everything we've done. You now know these parts. You know these characters. Forget everything. Forget the movements I gave you. Forget the line readings. Now just go out and become these people and do it. And what an actor needs to do to become a character, the character is always within the actor or actress themselves. It's something within you. The fear, the humor, whatever it is that you're portraying comes from somewhere inside you. And what a director is always trying to do is use sense memory. In other words, give the actor, as a director with actors, I react largely like a psychiatrist. I'll talk to the actors first, at great length, about themselves. And in so doing, I'll have to reveal a lot about myself. And we try, with Linda Blair, for example, who was 12 years old, I would say, do you remember what it was that in your young life that made you so sad? What was it? And she described the death of her grandfather, for example. And when I wanted her to get into a hysterical mood, I would take her alone privately and talk to her about that. And then when she was in the emotional framework, I would send her out to the set to do it. And the same with all of the actors. No matter what their backgrounds were, you have to reach, hey, they must reach within themselves to recreate those emotions of anger, sorrow, love, hatred, whatever it is. And that's what I'm constantly doing. I'm not saying, say this line like this, or, you know, move over there. You know, I'm giving them the freedom to create the parts, and I'll make some adjustments, but I'm suggesting to them what I know it is about them that will get to the heart of the emotion in the scene.